天上嘅一粒孤星點可以成為一個星座呢？一件單獨嘅事件點會引起我哋嘅興趣呢？世事就好似天上好多粒星串連起上嚟，先至可以變成一個有意義、有思考、有想像嘅星座。彌敦道證交所每一位嘉賓所講嘅説話，就好似天上一粒星星發出嘅光芒，勾畫出政治、經濟、文化、歷史等唔同層面嘅一張圖畫，俾我哋細心欣賞、深入分析同埋思考背後嘅意義。
離地新聞
逢星期四晚6點半，要管世間事，必先識世間事。Okay, second part of Lady News. I'm Titus, and we have two guests. We have Gloria, we have Chemi Lhamo, the student union leader of University of Toronto of Scarborough campuses, and she gets some trouble from the Chinese student in there, by the way. So we keep on talking about, we go on with the Tibet. Maybe I start with a very simple question. Okay, a lot of Chinese think Tibet is just Tibet Autonomous Region, but probably Tibet is way larger than that. Yes. So can you talk a little bit, make a very short introduction about what Tibet is in terms of geography?
Definitely. So there are actually 5 different provinces that Tibet actually goes really into, and currently what they deem as the TAR region, the Tibetan Autonomous Region, is less than 1/3 of the actual geographic space that they claim, which is China, and you can actually see the border. We used to, in our history lessons or like back home when we talk about Tibet, it says that it's the shape of a shoe. It's actually the whole Himalayan border, and much larger than what China claims it to be as a TAR region.
So that's my next question. So they make the Tibet smaller in terms of to make it smaller. So what do you think why they do that, by the way?
Many reasons, right? Because one, they want to make it seem like it's just a small region of China, right? And they want the international community to think that all Tibetans live only within the TAR region, which is not the case, because the true region is, you can see during the 2008 Olympics when there was an uprising, there was uprisings all across real original Tibet, right? And that's one way to sort of put them into a small box or into a small room and just say that's Tibet, and that Tibet is, like the Lhasa, the capital city, you can go and check, and it's a tourist spot, right? Those are the places that they have literally increased security, have monetized so much from it, but also made it look like a poster province, right? For people to go and visit and do all the things that they want to. But all the real rural parts of Tibet, have no access to a lot of other rights that other Canadian or Chinese citizens can exercise.
So when we are talking about the issue of Tibet, we are not just talking about Tibetan Autonomous Region, but we also talk about those provinces surrounding it, which also has a big population of Tibetans in there, like Qinghai province.
Yes, Qinghai, Yunnan, Guangzhou,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I also have an interest about my next question is talking about, okay, since we talk about a lot of problems in the Chinese put onto Tibet as a whole, so what is the different fraction or different people, different opinion about the future of Tibet? So you probably have a political party, for example, in Quebec. It's kind of like we have a Bloc Québécois, we have a Parti Québécois, and then there are different opinions like Quebec Solitaire, things like that. So what is the people think about the future of Tibet? What is a different group of people thinking about it?
So first off, I would like to talk about, the stance that His Holiness the Dalai Lama has taken, the stance that our Parliament in Exile has taken, which is the middle way. The middle way seeks genuine autonomy underneath the Chinese constitution, right? The Chinese constitution says that, all ethnic minorities have the right to practice their religion. They have the right to freedom of religion and even language, right? Which is not the case, because someone like Tashi Wangchuk just recently got in prison for 5 years for asking why his niece and nephews cannot learn Tibetan inside Tibet, right? So that is one stance, which is the middle way policy of seeking genuine autonomy, actually allowing Tibetans to have their rule of law, right? And then the other is, of course, independence, right? Independence because before 1959, before the illegal occupation of Chinese troops, Tibet was a free country and was recognized by many international entities. Also see maps with the original Tibet, not Tar. And because of that historical context, the Tibetan people would like to go back to a free Tibet. Right, so those are the two sort of main views. One seeking genuine autonomy, and then the other is independence. But ultimately, they're just part of the movement, right? Just like any other movement, the goal is ultimately having basic human rights inside of Tibet, right? The goal is the same: is to ultimately have Tibetan people be the leaders of their own sort of country, or be the leaders of their own sort of future. Right? How they accomplish it is different methods, but of course the one factor that is always together is our nonviolent direct action.
Actually, I've been invited to visit Dharamsala by the government in exile before, and based on my observation there and also around the world, I see also some conflict between the two factions, right? But it's just like Hong Kong again. Yeah, the older generation who were born in China, who have come out of Tibet to Dharamsala, I think they are very diehard followers of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and they basically would support the middle way. However, the younger generation who were born abroad, right, around the world, they are much for independence. So I think this is the kind of observation I have
If you want
made.
to generalize, I guess that could apply. But then, of course, there's always different views within the movement, right? There are many folks within the older generation that also seek independence, but there's also a lot of young generation students these days. Even I think there's an organization in Boston called Youth for Umelam. Umelam is the middle way. So there's youth that are coming together rallying for the middle way policy. So there is a lot of mixed sort of feelings about how we want to go about it, but I wouldn't say it's conflict, because I think ultimately the goal is the same. We're all within the same community, and having different perspectives is always richer, because it makes our movement dynamic, and that's how it is, right? We're not just a single story. We're not just this or this, right? There's many ways to go about it. Give us this, if not then this, right? We want more, or we want our free Tibet. But if free Tibet is not possible, then at least we want genuine autonomy. And that makes our whole movement so much more dynamic the way it is.
But how is the collaboration between the two factions around the world? And has there been, identification of a common strategy, tactic, and action plan, across, the whole political spectrum?
Well, there has been, I think, because even take for Toronto, for example, right? Someone like Students for Free Tibet, they seek independence. They seek a free Tibet, right? But then the cultural groups that exist within in Toronto, like the Tibetan Women's Association, or the cultural the branch of the Central Tibetan Administration of our Parliament in Exile, the branch here that exists, they are all for middle way. Right? But we all come together on March 10th to do our protest. We all come together to celebrate His Holiness the Dalai Lama's birthday. We all come together during the time he received the Nobel Peace Prize, which is December 10th. So all these times we come together as a community, and there's one unifying factor, which is our Tibetan identity. Right? So at those times we come together, but in addition to that, like in terms of policy and strategy,
Yes.
recently the Central Tibetan Administration hosted a 550 forum last year. And during that time, all members, not just within the middle way policy and people under the middle way sort of agenda, it wasn't just them. It was everyone from different walks of life. You know, there's a youth conference, there was a seniors conference, there was a lot of other topics that were explored, and members from all different voices were actually included. And it wasn't just independence versus genuine autonomy. There were also a lot of young professionals that were saying it doesn't have to be one or the other, it can be both, or it doesn't have to be either or. It's about self-determination, right? The right to self-determination, as in the Tibetan people are to decide. And this is all conversation happening in exile, and we represent less than 3% of the actual Tibetan population in the world, right? So the real question, or like the real sort of responsibility or the deciding factor, would be the people inside of Tibet. Because I live a life of privilege, right? Like I don't go. People here in Canada might think that I'm like being, you know, abused and harassed, but for me, it's like the little window to see what's actually happening inside my real home. Which is, you know, Tibetans inside of Tibet are still struggling. Tibetans inside of Tibet can't even learn Tibetan in school. Right? Here I have the opportunity of learning it anywhere I go. Right? I can just turn on my computer and like go on Facebook or YouTube and like watch it. Right? There's so many opportunities that I have. So if I were to compare it back home, it's like, you know, it's completely nothing.
Yeah, actually, I also have a question with respect to the future of Tibet movement, because I think in traditionally, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has been enjoying a very high degree of reputation and recognition by Tibetan people across the board. And so a lot of people are willing to be under his leadership, right? But there may come a day, right, when His Holiness, right, may have come to term of his life journey. Then would you see any possibility of crisis in unity when that occurs?
Well, that's the hard-hitting question. Of course, there are many challenges that occur when such a strong leader, you know, kind of passes. And that's bound to happen, right? Ultimately, he is in a human form, so that will happen, and it is a truth. But I think, you know, there's two ways to go about it. I always like to be realistic, but I also am optimistic in many ways, because, you know, right now we have His Holiness and we are united, right? But when His Holiness is no longer with us physically, then maybe that is a time for Tibetan people all across the world to come together even more. It's even more important. Now that we don't have the glue, it's more important that we act as glue and we link each other up, rather than having His Holiness presence do that for us right now. Now it's our responsibility for us to take our hands out and join our hands together, right? So I would see it as an opportunity, as a call to action for the Tibetan people, for our allies, for, you know, communities to come together, saying that now that His Holiness is not here physically, it's our responsibility to come together. And His Holiness has already mentioned that if the Tibetan people would like His Holiness to return, then he will reincarnate again, right? And that is depending on how the Tibetan people, I guess, want it.
So I also have a question talking about self-determination. I also heard a terms pretty similar for the Hong Kong people. It's kind of like a one country, two system, things like that. I know those people who closer to Dalai Lama, may not be himself, I'm not sure, would like to have Tibet to have a real autonomous under the one country, two system.
Sort of policy, yeah.
Policy. So what do you think about it? Since we know that since the 1959, when His Holiness escaped Tibet, it's kind of like before that there was a peace treaty between Tibet and China, but it seems that the communist Chinese doesn't hold the trust on some kind of a treaty. So if you're talking about this kind of one country, two system thing, that would means you put the trust in Communist China that you will follow the treaty, follow the law, follow the rules. And it seems that according to history, they are not very
Consistent.
And not to be trusted, to say the least. So what do you think about that?
Oh, a lot of things to take on. You know, when you started talking, it reminded me of how we in Canada have not kept up our treaties, right? We still sign contracts with oil companies that are literally ruining our Indigenous communities even today, right? And that's the reason why Indigenous communities have no access to clean water, even right now. So very similar things sort of ring in my head every time you say these things. But in conclusion of, or in reference to your question, it's hard to answer because my Buddhist self says that, everyone has the potential has the Buddha nature in them. So you always want to ensure that you give others the opportunity to do the right thing, right? And that would mean if our leadership goes in a direction where we do kind of follow that one country, two system policy, we would have faith in the leadership of China or whatever China that is at that time, maybe not a communist China, we'll see, at that time to uphold the treaty, right? Because that's the right thing to do, and that's the hope. But that would always depend on the context. At that time, who the leadership is, who's signing that contract, what their historical sort of history is, historical record is. So it would really depend on the situation at that time when it's happening and what is the international community looking like. Are we going to have a climate change global crisis where, politics doesn't even matter? Everyone is worried about the earth because we're all worried about going to Mars like Elon Musk, right? So it depends on the context of that situation, right? What is the international community looking like? What is United Nations looking like, right? And where does China fall under United Nations in terms of their power there? There's a lot of things to worry about.
Can I just comment on this? I think based on the one country system experience that Hong Kong has gone through, I doubt very much that a lot of Tibetan friends will have faith in the so-called one country two system for the Tibetan region, because China can give you the moon, but the thing is, by the time when it's under its control, they will find ways to break the promises. Just look at what is happening in Hong Kong, right? The National Congress of China can reinterpret the basic laws, right? Can postpone the time for universal suffrage for political elections in Hong Kong forever, again and again and again and again.
Candidates.
Exactly. They're waiting for the entire population of Hong Kong to be totally diluted by the influx of immigrants from mainland China. So by the end of the day, even if they give you one person, one vote, and even if there's a direct election, they will still win.
Win the majority,
Exactly.
Well, today we have Cambridge Analytica, and actually why I asked this question, because it's kind of like Tibet's issue is not only about Tibetans, Chinese, it's also a very global issue, because it's kind of like you mentioned colonialism before, and it's kind of like when someone who claimed that they are high culture comes into a new land, they probably will do something pretty similar. So I think this is my concern when we are talking about the future of Tibetans as well, because if we don't consider this kind of possibility, history will repeat itself again. So
I would say don't worry, because the Tibetan people are very strong and resilient. Like you folks were talking about Hong Kong earlier, and we mentioned how there's so many similarities, but there's also a big difference of how Tibet has been treated so much worse for the past 60 years.
Absolutely.
Right? And
Absolutely.
we think that, Hong Kong and nations like Taiwan has so much potential to organize and do much more than you folks are. I think it's a call to action for people watching to come together and, support the organizers that are already doing amazing work, and for you to get more involved to do something. Because Tibetans, despite the repression, even inside Tibet right now, they find ways. It's a media black hole, but they still find VPN apps and try to find ways to go back on Instagram, back on other apps where they can talk about the Dalai Lama. And if they can't talk about Xi Jinping directly, they start talking about Winnie the Pooh, right? They find other creative ways of resistance and resiliency that is just absolutely phenomenal. So there's no reason for us to give up. Especially you folks. We have not given up, so there's no reason for you to give up. I think you have a long way to go.
I can't agree with you more, because I think I've been much inspired by the spirit of the Tibetan movement, because despite all the challenges, despite all the brutal crackdown all these years, I see a lot of a very strong determination, right, to chase after Tibetan mission, right, to fight for freedom and also autonomy in Tibet. And even in terms of the spirit of the movement, I've been much inspired by, our friends from the Tibetan movement here. Yeah.
Okay, so this is my last question then.
Yes.
The Tibetans example, how it can be. What is the teaching from Tibet? So what
lessons learned?
What lesson learned?
Oh, so many. You can see, I think actions speak louder than words, right? So take a look at Tibet right now. There is nomadic displacement happening. So the Tibetans inside Tibet are being relocated in different areas. Environmental degradation, right? Complete ruckus out of our environment. What once used to be the cleanest air and the cleanest water now is suffering from pollution, right? Where they're trying to sell our water and sell our air to our own citizens, which is ridiculous. And so that sort of annexation of a nation, right, can be seen as an example and should be something that, not just worry about your own country. It's like, we as an international sort of community and entity need to be worried about how China is behaving, and how we as even Canadians and Americans are giving in to helping China, right? When we're not part of the solution, we're actually part of the problem. And the reason why China has been growing so much is because we've never sort of officially condemned them for everything. We still have trade agreements with China, right? We still continue to sell our mining companies and still continue to invest in areas like Tibet, which is very problematic because of their treatment of the Tibetan people and other communities that are oppressed. And then, so that speaks to, one, of course, the future of all the other countries that are going to deal with China, because they're going to just do whatever they want, because nobody is going to say anything. That's one. The other is to speak to the obligation that we all have, even right now, right? Not even being scared about the future, but right now, what you can do as a Canadian. What can you do to ensure that you are not just a bystander and you're just quiet, because it's going to affect you. And I can be the best example. Living in Canada, never did I think that I was standing up for student politics would be something that China as a state would be angry about. But they've released articles on me calling me a separatist on Global Times. And I'm just a 23-year-old who wants to do student politics because Doug Ford is taking our money from our education system, right? So that shows the long arm, the sharp power, the soft power, whatever you want to call it, that how China is influencing even a free country like Canada.
Yeah,
right?
I think I see opportunity there because in recent years, there has been increasing awareness around the world towards the threats from China's sharp power operation around the world. So I think democratic institutions started to realize that, start to realize the true nature of the Communist Party of China's rule, right? It's not anything like any of the country in the democratic camp, right? We're dealing with a regime that is very arrogant in controlling the world, in manipulating and infiltrating the world, through very sophisticated means, sometimes to such an extent of colluding the election campaigns of other countries. And so I think this is about the time for people around the world, civil society, to join force together, right? And at the same time, we also need to urge our own government, right, to be aware of China's sharp power in their own country. Because if we can do our work well in our own country, I'm quite sure someday there will come a day when the CCP will lose its legitimacy in China.
Okay, so we are about time, so we have some other thoughts. Okay, there are some news from Hong Kong actually as well. So you want to talk about it?
Oh, sure. I think one of the major issue confronting the civil society of Hong Kong, as well as civil society around the world, is the Hong Kong government's proposed amendments to the extradition law. And they are proposing to cover Hong Kong and Taiwan.
Yep.
And if this amendment is enacted, I can see a lot of threat being posed to both Hong Kongers as well as other people around the world, because that means that the China can ask the Hong Kong government to extradite anyone that they consider to be engage in criminal acts back to mainland China. However, in the absence of a democratic system and also a totally independent judicial system in China, we cannot trust that anybody being extradited will be subject to a fair trial, let alone many of the violation of human rights when they are put to jail. And some of them have even been made to disappear, right? Therefore, this amendment has aroused concerns around the world. And just recently, 10 Hong Kong support organizations around the world, particularly in North America, have already come up with a joint statement opposing to this amendment to the extradition laws. And we hope that actually in this coming Saturday on April 13 at 11 a.m., Canada-Hong Kong Link in Toronto is going to host a rally inviting community leaders from different sectors from Canada to speak at this rally to express the concern towards this proposed amendments to extradition law in Hong Kong, because we feel that we will be, significantly affected by this law. And it's not only, confined to so-called dissidents. Anybody in trade, anybody working for the government, like the 2 Canadians who have been arrested recently with the Meng Wanzhou case, right? Or some of those people who have been already in prison, and then all of a sudden they could change the allegation at the very last minute. So this is what we call
death penalty.
Exactly.
Actually.
This is what we call the arbitrary allegation. So we cannot trust China, and I think it's about time for all of us from across Canada as well as around the world to come forward to render our support to the civil society in Hong Kong to oppose this proposed amendments. And we really need to show our solidarity with the Hong Kong people.
Yeah, and we actually will talk about it in details and in Cantonese next week with Gloria here as well again. So stay tuned. OK，今日嘅離地新聞時間差唔多啦。如果大家對我哋呢個禮拜嘅討論有進一步意見，可以喺 Facebook 搜尋 Lady News LAYDAYNEWS 就揾到我哋個 page 㗎啦。我哋呢個節目每逢星期四香港時間晚上6點半到7點半，或者多倫多時間早上5點半到6點半，唔係6點半到7點半喺城寨網上直播，詳情可以到 Singjai.HK 查詢㗎。呢期離地新聞係2019年4月10號多倫多時間晚上8點，即係香港時間4月11號早上8點錄影嘅。下星期再見，拜拜。
希望大家踴躍參加我哋13號11點喺經貿處嘅集會。多謝。
拜拜。